Thank you so much for tuning in. So today we're talking about the difference between Japanese and Chinese. How different are these two languages? Say, for example, you were to become proficient in Mandarin Chinese, how much Japanese would you understand? And vice versa, if you were able to become really fluent in Japanese, how much Chinese could you understand without actually studying? Well, close to none. But how is that possible? See, although geographically China and Japan are very close, they're two languages, so Mandarin Chinese in this case, although there are many different kinds of Chinese languages, I'd like to say, rather than dialects, because they differ a lot. But there are many different kinds of Chinese, but Mandarin is usually what people refer to when they just say Chinese. It's the most spoken one. Well, Mandarin Chinese and Japanese are completely separate languages, apart from the heavy influence the Chinese had onto Japanese. So they belong to two completely distinct families, but Chinese has influenced Japanese heavily. We mostly see an example of this kind of influence, the Mandarin Chinese. In general, Chinese languages head over Japanese. We see it through the writing system, because you have to remember that the Japanese, they basically took the Chinese writing system, which in fact called kanji, which means the letter of the Han, so the letter of the Chinese, the ethnic group being the Han, and they adapted it to Japanese. They did not make the kanji. There are some very rare kanjis that are original Japanese, but I'm talking about, like, you can count them in two hands. The majority of kanji, 99.9% of kanji, are Chinese in origin. They were only adapted to the Japanese language. The second way in which Chinese influenced Japanese is in the sort of more complex vocabulary. So basically, there are a lot of Japanese words that are actually related to Chinese, and that happens because of the way kanji work. So basically, when you have a kanji, such as, for example, the kanji for, let's say, water, normally when you see the kanji on its own in Japanese, you will pronounce it mizu. That's the original Japanese way, the sound that describes the element water in the original indigenous Japanese language. So you see the kanji for water, you want to say water, you say it mizu. However, when you find the kanji put inside a sentence, or to create a more complex or a compound, so a more complex word, then you most likely won't read it mizu with the original Japanese reading, which is called kun yomi, kun reading, but you will use the Sino-Japanese reading, so the sort of original Chinese pronunciation which has been adapted to the Japanese pronunciation. An example of this is the word for Wednesday, which is day of water. They don't say mizu yobi, they say sui yobi. So the pronunciation sui is not original Japanese, it's the way the Japanese represent the original way of reading the kanji, or the hanzi in Chinese. In fact, in modern day Chinese, the character for water is pronounced shui. So how did shui become sui? Well, interestingly enough, many of these characters arrived, and together with their pronunciations, arrived in Japan in different time periods, and they also reached Japan from different regions of China. Now, for example, if you look at even modern day southern Chinese, you will notice that people in the south of China will not pronounce it shui, but they will pronounce it sui. So already you can see where probably the Japanese got the pronunciation. So this pronunciation of the original Chinese character reaches Japan, that the Japanese modify it to adapt it to their own pronunciation, and then it becomes integrated into the language. Something similar happened in English. If you think about it, English is a Germanic language, so it has nothing to do with, for example, Italian, French, or Spanish, and yet 40% of the vocabulary in English is Latin-based, and that is because of all the historical situations that happen, like battles and dominations, to say to the Romans speaking Latin and the Normans speaking French, medieval French, 1066, but also all the heavy cultural influence. So you have many words in English that obviously come from the Romance languages, even though English is not a Romance language itself. And that's basically what's happening between Chinese and Japanese. So as an English speaker, if you study absolutely zero Italian, will you be able to understand my following sentence? Non ho avuto modo di fare tutto quello che avrei voluto, se avessi avuto aiuto, lo avrei fatto. Now, most likely, if you're not trained in Romance languages, you will not have understood anything, or almost close to anything, because I specifically chose words in Italian, which are perfect Italian words, but they don't really resemble that much English words. However, if I say a sentence such as la mentalità degli italiani è differente dalla mentalità degli inglesi. So this sentence probably was easier to understand. Perhaps you didn't understand everything, but mentality sounds like mentalità. Differente sounds like different. So you can see, depending on what words I use, it will be easier or harder for Anglophone speakers to understand Italian, for example. So there is a similar situation between Chinese and Japanese. However, the way the Japanese pronounce the characters is very different from the way the Chinese. You can tell that there is some resemblance sometimes, but most of the times they just sound too differently also, because with Mandarin Chinese you've got pitches, as you probably know, which of course in Japanese you also have, but they don't work the same way, and therefore, to cut a long story short, even if you're very proficient in Mandarin Chinese, you will not understand Japanese, and even if you're very proficient in Japanese, you will not understand Mandarin Chinese when they are spoken. However, when they are written, then it's a completely different kettle of fish, because luckily the characters usually are similar. Not always, but usually if you write very basic sentences, then you will be able to understand even though you don't know how to pronounce it. So far we understand that if you hear them spoken, then yes, they are quite different. But if you see them written, sometimes you'll be able to understand quite a bit. But what about grammar? Well, the grammar is completely different. So Chinese grammar is a lot more simple, it's a lot easier than Japanese grammar. And this might sound strange because you know that Chinese is considered one of the hardest languages in the world. Most of the times people think that Chinese is harder. Well, here's the thing. None of the two languages, it's impossible to say which of the two languages is harder because it very much depends on the person who's trying to learn them. The main obstacle with Chinese is the pronunciation. If you have a good pronunciation, good tendency towards pronunciation, got a good ear, musicality, you're good at just repeating things just the way the natives say, then for you Chinese will be easier because the grammar is easier and the main obstacle is indeed pronunciation. But if you have problems with pronunciation, and oftentimes they say something, you think you're saying the same, but they tell you it's completely different and you can't even tell what the difference is. If you have a hard time picking up accents or understanding how to pronounce things, then Chinese will be impossible for you to do because they rely heavily on the differences of pitches to rely different semantic fields. So basically to say completely different things. In that case, Japanese will be easier for you because in Japanese, even if you mess up the pronunciation, they can still understand it a lot more easily. But keep in mind that the grammar is harder. Now to give you some examples of how these languages sound like. 今天我要去中国。今日中国に行きたいです。这是我的浴室。これは私のトイレです。我在厨房做飯。私は台所で飯を作ります。The sentence structure is very different. Let's examine, for example, the sentence I go back home, I return home. Well, in Chinese, we would say 我回家. In Japanese, the same sentence would become 家に戻ります. 家に戻ります. So as you can tell, Chinese is a subject, verb, object language, whereas Japanese is a subject, object, verb language. So the verb goes at the end, and that makes it harder, of course, to pick up speed when you speak, unless you are very well trained with it. Okay, so this was a brief discussion about Chinese and Japanese, but I'd like to build upon this through your questions. So feel free to write down as many questions as you want down below in the comments section about Chinese or Japanese, and I will address them on dedicated tutorials here. As always, I wish to thank you for watching this video and for joining Metatron's Academy.